Hello and welcome back. For those who are new to the channel, I've finished reviewing the Book of Mormon, and if you go to the channel page, you can find my review of each chapter. In today's video, I will be comparing Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon to Babe Ruth hitting his famous called shot. And I'd love to hear what you think about it. If you're not familiar with the called shot, let me explain. On October 1st, during Game 3 of the 1932 World Series, Babe Ruth stood at the plate, and with one strike already against him, he appeared to motion toward the center field fence. After taking a second strike, he repeated the gesture. Then he clobbered the ball 440 feet into center field, right where he had been pointing. Nearly 100 years later, his famous called shot is still debated. Some critics say he was pointing toward the center field flagpole, or that he was making hand gestures toward the Chicago Cubs bench while he was arguing with them. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because as impressive as it may be to crush the ball into the stands, it's a whole different thing to call it before you do it. Lots of people have hit home runs, but how many have announced it and then done it with the whole world watching? Except the Babe Ruth analogy falls a little short of what Joseph Smith did. No one was surprised when the great Bambino hit a home run. He did that more than anyone. Picture an unknown, undrafted player coming to the plate and announcing that he was going to hit a home run. But enough about home runs. Did Joseph Smith actually call his shot? For those of you not familiar with Joseph Smith, he was a largely uneducated farm boy living in upstate New York in the 1820s. According to Joseph Smith, an angel named Moroni appeared to him and told him to translate and publish a book of ancient scriptures. But Joseph was broke and largely uneducated. He was also carrying some reputational baggage. He was known in his local community for using a seer stone to find lost or hidden objects. Because of this, just 2 years earlier in 1825, some men had hired him to help him look for hidden Spanish treasure. That's not rumor, by the way. That's from the church's official website. When Joseph announced that he had unearthed some golden plates that he was going to translate, some of the men who had hired him to find Spanish gold felt that those gold plates that he had found belonged to them, and they made his life miserable trying to take the plates from him. So to escape the commotion over the plates in Palmyra, New York, he and his wife Emma moved to his in-laws' place in Harmony, Pennsylvania. So the Book of Mormon did not come forth in a vacuum. He announced that he had found some gold plates and was going to translate them. And the people in the area knew about it and bothered him about it until he moved to a different state so they'd leave him alone. Picture yourself being in Joseph's situation. You've announced that you're going to translate an ancient record. And that's a big undertaking on its own, but to attempt such a project when you're flat broke and you're not very strong academically, that's just crazy. A nearby landowner named Martin Harris offered to fund Joseph's translation project, and he eventually paid for its printing too. But Joseph wasn't a good writer. He needed people to write the book as he translated it. And over the course of translating the Book of Mormon, he went through several scribes who would write the words as he dictated them. And when I say dictate, Royal Skousen, the BYU professor charged with analyzing what remains of the original manuscript, describes several names in the Book of Mormon as being written a letter at a time, as though they were spelled out. So Joseph basically dictated the Book of Mormon, and his scribes wrote it one word at a time. So the people back in New York knew about his translation project. The people in Harmony, Pennsylvania knew about it. His scribes knew about it. And then there was Martin Harris who was paying for it. And Martin's marriage was in trouble because his wife Lucy felt that Joseph was conning them. So Martin asked Joseph if they could show his wife what had been translated up to that point. And you're probably familiar with how that story played out. Joseph eventually let Martin take the manuscript, and it was never seen again. The couple, Martin and Lucy, eventually separated, but to her deathbed, Lucy Harris denied taking the manuscript. My point isn't to talk about Martin Harris and his marriage, but to show that a lot of people, real people, had heard Joseph promise to translate the book and were waiting to see if he could deliver on it. Joseph had pointed to the center field fence and called his shot, and Martin had literally bet the farm on it. The thing is, if Joseph didn't really translate the record as he said, but instead invented it for who knows what motive, he could have written a lot less. I mean, seriously, 500 pages. He could have proven his point and kept his promise with a lot less writing than 500 pages. But not only was Joseph writing an insane amount of content, he acted like he was on a tight publication deadline. Now, about publication. Copyright laws at the time didn't require you to submit your whole book when you applied for your copyright. All you needed to submit was a title page. So on June 11th, 1829, Joseph submitted his title page to the federal district court. And the title page that he submitted is the same one that the book has today, with only a couple of edits. It was the one written by Moroni on the very last plate engraved by Moroni before he buried the plates. And it did not read like plain English. Here's how it begins. And picture being the copyright clerk and seeing this. The Book of Mormon, an account written by the hand of Mormon upon plates, taken from the plates of Nephi. Wherefore it is an abridgment of the record of the people of Nephi and also of the Lamanites, written to the Lamanites who are a remnant of the house of Israel. And so on. Then, now that he had applied for his copyright, Joseph needed to finish translating the book. You may be wondering, if Joseph had already translated the very last page written by Moroni, what else was there to translate? Well, as it turns out, Joseph now had to go back and replace the pages lost by Martin Harris, because after Martin lost the pages, when Joseph resumed translation, he didn't start over. He just pushed forward until he reached the end, until he reached that final title page. Then he applied for the copyright, and then he began translation on the small plates of Nephi. And we'll come back to that in a second. Meanwhile, back at the Copyright Office, people were having a field day with his title page. Someone wrote an article that included a copy of Moroni's title page, and it ran in more than 10 newspapers in New York, Ohio, and Massachusetts. A Rochester newspaper called Paul Pry's Weekly Bulletin began running a series called From the Golden Bible, where they wrote a column making fun of Joseph Smith and the biblical-sounding language of his copyright application. But since the Book of Mormon hadn't been published yet, they didn't know what to write, so they had to invent the whole thing every week or every month or however often it came out. The Golden Bible Chronicles had characters such as Horace the Publican, Israel the darky paramour, Wanton the physician, Chad the moneylender, and Samuel the miser, and also Joseph the dealer of fine linens and Hiram the Jeremite. Babe Ruth had to put up with the Chicago Cubs bench when he called a shot. By contrast, Joseph was getting pilloried all throughout New England, and the book hadn't even been published yet. When Joseph wrote in his history that he was surprised that, quote, men of high standing would take notice to excite the public mind against me and create a bitter persecution, that was no exaggeration. And picture how Lucy Harris must have felt. All of New England was mocking Joseph's translation efforts, and her husband was his financial backer. Also, if you look at the Book of Mormon seriously, it quickly becomes obvious that it couldn't have been invented by an uneducated farm boy. As just one example, the chronology of the Book of Mormon is internally consistent, meaning the dates, and there are loads of dates, are all consistent with each other, despite overlapping narratives, 3 different calendars being used, and other complicating factors. It wasn't until the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon, nearly 100 years after the first publication, that the modern BC and AD dates were added to the book as a reference. And the dates are all internally consistent. And it's just not reasonable for an uneducated guy to invent a complex book spanning 1,000 years with 3 different dating systems, and for all the dates to be consistent, especially when it was all basically a first draft that he narrated out loud. Combine that with the book's in-depth understanding of Old World horticulture that we see in Jacob 5, It's accurate descriptions of Arabic geography as Lehi and his family left Jerusalem and so many other things. And then you look at the really short translation timeline. So of the 3 years between when he got the plates and when he published the book, after you factor in moving and other documented things that Joseph had going on, he only would have had about 90 days total to work on the book. And so once people understand this, modern critics conclude that Joseph must have had someone helping him, or that there was a ghostwriter and Joseph simply took the credit. But given the amount of negative publicity, both from writers throughout New England and also locally from Lucy Harris and other local detractors, do you think that you could have secretly slipped a world-class scholar into the translation effort in Harmony, Pennsylvania, without Lucy Harris or anyone else noticing? Or more realistically, a whole team of world-class scholars? At the very least, the scribes would have noticed. As incredible as it may seem, the most logical explanation is that the book came from Joseph Smith without outside help, other than the handful of scribes who wrote down what he said as he translated. Okay, sorry for the sidebar. Now we go back to the translation effort which Joseph had to finish. When Martin Harris borrowed the 116 pages, and that wasn't everything that had been translated, by the way, Joseph had retained the last few pages on which they were working. In Doctrine and Covenants 10, the Lord explained how to replace the content that they had lost. Here's what he said, verse 41. Therefore you shall translate the engravings, which are on the plates of Nephi, down even till you come to the reign of King Benjamin, or until you come to that which you have translated, which you have retained. So Joseph translated the small plates of Nephi, and Oliver Cowdery merged them with the remainder of the translation when he prepared the printer's manuscript. I talk about this in a lot more detail in my video about Words of Mormon. I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Be sure to check it out if you're interested. They got the printer's manuscript to the publisher and he began working on it, but the Book of Mormon was a hot topic. It was such a hot topic, in fact, that a Palmyra newspaper got a hold of some of its pages and began printing those until they received a legal order to stop. But Joseph wasn't done calling shots yet either. There was one more, which I'll get to in a second. Finally, after all the trouble and commotion, the Book of Mormon was finished, published, and available for sale. Picture yourself as a curious citizen of Palmyra, standing in a muddy street. You walk up to a bookstand and pick up a copy of this fraudster's long-awaited book, and you turn through the pages, trying to see for yourself what all the fuss is about. You turn to 2 Nephi chapter 3, and you find that young Joseph has had the impudence to call one more shot. In that chapter, he references himself by name, Joseph, and claims that the work that this Joseph will bring forth will go forth to the world as a testament of Christ, and that its followers will work mighty miracles. I mean, it was miraculous enough that this uneducated guy said that he'd translate an ancient record and that he'd actually delivered on that. And not just delivered, but written more than 500 pages. That's not like Babe Ruth hitting a home run. That's more like the bat boy getting called to the plate, saying he's going to hit a home run, and then crushing one over the bleachers and way out into the parking lot. And then for the book to claim in 2 Nephi 3 that it, the book, the invention of an uneducated treasure hunter, would go forth to the world and have followers. Talk about delusions of grandeur. But then you fast forward a couple hundred years, and you find that there are more than 60,000 missionaries scattered all across the globe sharing that book with people. And 2 years later, there's another batch of 60,000 missionaries. Babe Ruth and his called shot have nothing on this guy. Time to hit the subscribe button, and we will see you next time.